Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling accounts ever whispered through the corridors of the American South. Before we begin, I want you to do something simple. Pause for a moment and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are. There is something about stories like this, stories that travel across distance and time, that makes you wonder who else is hearing them and at what hour of the night or day they choose to listen. Because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is something that lingers, something that seems to wait, and perhaps something that still listens back. It is a spring evening in Charleston, South Carolina. The year is 1847. The sun is going down slow and gold behind the church steeples on Meeting Street, and the light is spilling through the wrought iron gates of the grandest houses on the peninsula like honey through a comb. Somewhere, a piano is being played, badly, by a child. Somewhere else, a horse is being brushed down for the night. In the harbor, the ships from Liverpool and Havana are riding at anchor, and the last of the day's slaves are being marched back from the wharves toward their quarters, their bare feet quiet on the cobblestones. And in a 3-story mansion on East Bay Street, a house so tall and so pale it looked, in the failing light, like a bone standing on end, 2 brothers were sitting on either side of a long dinner table, not eating. They were staring at each other. And between them, on the polished mahogany, was a single sheet of paper. A bill of sale. The older brother's name was Ambrose Ravenel. He was 31. He was the heir. He wore his father's watch chain across his vest and his father's ring on his hand, and he had, on this particular evening, his father's cold, patient rage sitting behind his eyes. The younger brother's name was Julian Ravenel. He was 26. He was the second son, which in Charleston in 1847 was a kind of soft, useless thing to be. A man born into wealth but not into inheritance. A man who wrote poetry no one read and painted watercolors of the marshes at low tide and had never, in his entire life, been asked to make a decision that mattered. Until now. Because the bill of sale on the table between them was for a woman, a 22-year-old enslaved woman named Selah. She had been born in the Ravenel house. She had grown up in the Ravenel kitchen. She had, since the age of 12, been the personal attendant of the brother's late mother, and she had, in the year and a half since that woman's death, become, in ways neither of the brothers had said out loud yet, the very center of gravity of the household. The one everyone listened for on the stairs. The one whose voice, humming through the halls in the early morning, told the rest of the servants that the day had begun. And Ambrose, the older brother, had just informed Julian that he was going to sell her. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because she was disobedient, not because the family needed the money. The Ravenels did not need money the way rivers do not need rain. He was going to sell her because, in his own careful words spoken across that table in a voice like a closing door, she has become a problem in this house. And Julian, the poet, the painter, the second son who had never in his life stood up to his older brother about anything, looked at the paper on the table and then looked at his brother and said something very quiet. He said, "You will not." Nobody in that house, not the butler standing frozen in the doorway with the wine, not the cook listening from the hall, not Ambrose himself, had ever heard Julian Ravenel say the word "not" to his brother in his entire life. The silence that followed was so long and so deep that 30 years later, servants who had been in that house that night would still say they remembered it, the exact quality of it, the way even the clock on the mantel seemed to hesitate before it struck. What none of them knew not the brothers, not the servants, not the woman upstairs herself, folding linens in a room lit by a single candle, was that a decision was being made in that dining room that would follow every single one of them into their graves. That before another year had passed, one brother would be gone from Charleston forever. That before another 5 years had passed, the house on East Bay Street would be sold to strangers, its rooms emptied, its garden overgrown, its shutters closed. That the name Ravenel, which in 1847 was spoken in Charleston the way you might speak the name of a king, would, within the memory of a single generation, become the name people whispered instead of said. And it would all begin, and it would all end, with a woman named Selah. She could not read. She could not write. She had no last name that any court would recognize. On the paper on that table she was described, in a merchant's careful hand, as female, mulatto, aged approximately 22, healthy, house-trained, valued at $1,400. But before this night was over, she would be the most important human being in that house. Before this year was over, she would be the most important human being in the lives of both of those brothers. And before this story is over, the one you and I are going to sit with tonight, you will understand why, more than a century and a half later, in a graveyard in Charleston that you can still walk through on a Sunday afternoon, there are 2 Ravenel headstones standing side by side that do not face each other. They face her. Her name was Selah. She was born property, and she broke 2 men who thought they owned the world. Sit down. Turn out the lights if you can, because this is an old Charleston story, and old Charleston stories are never quite finished. They only wait for someone to tell them again. To understand what happened at that dinner table in 1847, you have to understand the house it happened in. And to understand the house, you have to understand Charleston itself. Because Charleston, in the years before the Civil War, was not merely a city. It was a mood. It was a state of mind. It was a small, elegant, dangerously beautiful place where a certain kind of American wealth had grown fat on a certain kind of American sin, and had learned, over generations, to wear that sin like a well-cut coat. By the 1840s, more enslaved Africans had been brought through the port of Charleston than through any other port in North America. 40% of every human being ever sold into slavery on the mainland of the United States had first stepped, in chains, onto a Charleston wharf. The city's fortune had been built on that traffic, on rice, on indigo, on cotton, and on the bodies that had planted and harvested and processed all 3. By 1820, more than half the people who lived inside the city limits of Charleston were enslaved. By 1840, the great houses south of Broad Street were being built ever taller and ever paler, their double piazzas turning to catch the harbor breeze, their gardens walled in brick to keep the world out. The Ravenel family had been part of it from the beginning. They were Huguenots, French Protestants who had fled Catholic France in the 1680s and washed up on the Carolina coast, penniless and pious and hungry. Within 2 generations, they were rice planters. Within 3, they owned a plantation on the Cooper River with more than 200 enslaved people working it. Within 4, they owned the house on East Bay Street. 3 stories of Charleston stucco painted the color of old ivory, with black shutters and a garden of tea olives and a wrought iron gate stamped on both sides with the family monogram. The father of our 2 brothers was a man named Edmund Ravenel. He was, by every account that survives of him, a hard, quiet, God-fearing man who did not raise his voice and did not raise his hand, and did not need to do either of those things, because the household ran on the invisible track his silence had laid down. He was the kind of slaveholder that Charleston liked to produce in the years before the war. Never crude, never violent in public, always at church on Sunday, always at the St. Cecilia Society ball in the winter, always polite to his human property in a way that convinced him he was a kind man. His wife was named Cornelia. She was a Rutledge on her mother's side, which in Charleston was a kind of currency, and she was a small, beautiful, nervous woman who suffered from what the family doctor called delicate lungs and what modern medicine would probably call tuberculosis. She spent the last decade of her life mostly in an upstairs bedroom, propped on pillows, coughing quietly into a lace handkerchief, being read to. And it was Cornelia who first noticed Selah. Selah had been born in the Ravenel kitchen in the spring of 1825. Her mother was a woman named Judith, who had been the cook in the East Bay Street house for as long as anyone could remember. Judith was tall and quiet, and had the kind of face that looked, even when she was young, as though it had already seen everything. And Judith's daughter, the baby she laid down on a folded blanket in the corner of the kitchen while she stirred the pots, had come into the world with skin the color of dark honey and eyes the color of river water. I want you to stop on that detail for a moment, because in the Charleston of 1825, the color of an enslaved child's skin was not a decorative fact. It was a piece of evidence. A very light-skinned baby in the corner of a great house's kitchen was, more often than not, a piece of family news that no one in the family wanted to acknowledge. Nobody, in the years that followed, ever said out loud who Selah's father was. Judith took the answer to her grave. But everyone in the household, the other enslaved women in the yard, the coachman, the laundress, even Cornelia in her upstairs sick room, could see the child, and everyone could count backward 9 months, and everyone had ideas. The safest of those ideas was that Selah's father had been a free black carpenter who had done some work on the house the year before Selah was born and had briefly been permitted into the kitchen for his meals. That was the story Judith told when she was asked, which was seldom. It was a story with the great advantage of being unverifiable. The carpenter had moved on to Savannah before Judith's belly was showing, and no one had ever heard from him again. The less safe idea, the one that was never said out loud in the house but was said in the kitchen of the house next door and the house next door to that, was that Edmund Ravenel himself, for one lonely summer, while Cornelia was upstairs with her handkerchief, had made a choice that would echo through the rest of his family's life. I am not going to tell you tonight which of those things was true, because the truth of it, in the end, is not the point. The point is that both stories were possible in Charleston in 1825. Both stories were, in the aggregate of that city and that century, ordinary. And both stories, whichever one you chose to believe, meant the same thing for the child on the blanket. She was born property. She was entered into the Ravenel household ledger the same week she was baptized, in the same neat brown ink with the same clerical seriousness. Selah, female, born to Judith in the kitchen, April of this year. Value, to be assessed at age 12. She grew up in the yard behind the house. She played, when she was very small, with Ambrose and Julian, because in the Charleston of the 1820s, that was another one of the strange truths of the place. The enslaved children of the household and the white children of the household grew up together, ran together, chased each other around the same fig tree, until the day came, always around age 7 or 8, when the white children were called inside for their letters, and the black children were called out to their work, and everything that had been shared until then was quietly and permanently taken away. Ambrose was 9 years old when Sella was born. Julian was 4. They both remembered her from her very first summer in the yard. Ambrose remembered her later as a small, dark shape underfoot, an annoyance, a thing his mother said to be careful not to trip on. Julian remembered her differently. Julian remembered a girl who could climb the fig tree faster than he could, who once, when he had fallen and split his lip open on the brick path, had sat down beside him in the dirt and pressed her small hand against his mouth to stop the bleeding, and had said, in the voice of a child who had already been trained never to cry, "Hush now. It ain't so bad. Hush." He was 5 years old when she said that to him. He would remember it and repeat it to himself for the next 50 years of his life. Sella was 12 when Cornelia Ravenel called her upstairs. The mistress of the house had been growing weaker for months. The doctor had begun to speak in low tones on the front piazza about arrangements. Cornelia was going to need a personal attendant, someone to sit with her at night, to help her from the bed to the chair, to comb her hair, to read to her from the Bible, to hold the bowl for her when she coughed. And she wanted the girl from the kitchen, the quiet one, the one with the honey-colored skin and the river-colored eyes. "Send Sela up," Cornelia said. And Judith, in the kitchen, dried her hands slowly on her apron and did not say anything at all. She just kissed the top of her daughter's head, which she almost never did in front of the other servants, and sent her upstairs. From that day, for the next 9 years, Sela lived on the second floor of the Ravenel house. She learned to move quietly. She learned to fold linens the way Cornelia liked them folded. She learned the smell of camphor and the sound of a woman coughing into cloth. She learned the entire private geography of a slow dying. Every hour of the day, every small ritual of medicine and prayer, every small change in the color of a face on a pillow. She learned, in short, to be the last thing an old white woman saw before she closed her eyes at night, and the first thing she saw when she opened them in the morning. Cornelia Ravenel loved her. In a strange, twisted, deeply Charleston way, the only way that the mistress of a slave-holding house could love a black girl who belonged to her, she loved her. She read to her from the Bible. She taught her the alphabet in secret, the letters at night with the door closed, because in South Carolina in 1834 it was against the law to teach an enslaved person to read. By the time Sela was 15, she could read a psalm out loud in a voice so soft and so steady that the doctor once stood in the hallway outside the room just to listen to her. And downstairs, in the meantime, the two brothers were growing into the men they were going to be. Ambrose went off to South Carolina College in Columbia. He came back at 21 with his father's watch chain and his father's opinions and a very clear, very cold understanding of what he intended to do with the rest of his life. He was going to inherit. He was going to be the master of the East Bay Street house and the Cooper River plantation and the 211 human beings who worked it. He was going to sit on the vestry at St. Philip's, and he was going to marry a Pinckney or a Middleton, and he was going to be, in his generation, exactly what his father had been in his. A hard, quiet, well-tailored man at the center of a small, elegant, dangerous world. Julian went off to South Carolina College too, because Ravenels did. But Julian came back after 1 year and refused to go back for a second. He spent his early 20s in the house on East Bay Street, sleeping late, painting the marsh at low tide, reading English poetry, avoiding his father, and, everyone in the household eventually noticed, drifting more and more often into his mother's sick room to sit and talk with her. And with her attendant. By the time Julian was 24 and Selah was 19, the servants had begun to notice. Not in any way anyone could say out loud, not in any way anyone would ever have written down, just the small, telling, dangerous things. That Julian's paintings, which had once been of the marsh, were now often of a woman standing at a window. That he took his coffee upstairs in the morning instead of at the dining room table. That when Cornelia was sleeping, Julian and Selah would sit on the 2 chairs by the window and talk in low voices for an hour, sometimes 2. And in the fall of 1845, Cornelia Ravenel died. Selah was 20. She had been the last hand that touched Cornelia's forehead. She had been the voice that read the last psalm, Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, in the last hour of Cornelia's life. When the doctor came out of the room and closed the door softly and said the word, "Gone," it was Selah who was still sitting by the bed, holding the dead woman's hand. And it was Selah who, everyone in the household later said, did not cry. Because enslaved women in the Charleston of 1845 did not cry when their mistresses died. It was not one of the things they were allowed to do. But Julian cried. And 1.5 years later, when the household had settled into its new rhythm without Cornelia, when Edmund Ravenel had died too, of what the doctor called a sudden weakness of the heart, when Ambrose had become the master of the house and Julian was still the second son in the room down the hall, Julian Ravenel was still going upstairs every morning with 2 cups of coffee. And Ambrose Ravenel had begun, slowly, to notice. That was the winter of 1846. That was the winter the house began to feel, to anyone paying attention, like a room in which someone had lit a very slow, very quiet fuse. The bill of sale was drawn up in April of 1847, and that was how they came to be sitting at that dinner table on that spring evening, with a single sheet of paper between them, and Julian Ravenel saying, in a voice no one had ever heard him use before, "You will not." Let us go back to the room now, the dining room, the long mahogany table, the 2 brothers on either side, the paper between them. I want you to look at the paper first. It is folded once, lengthwise, the way bills of sale were folded in Charleston in 1847. It has been prepared by a broker named Silas Ryan, whose office was on Chalmers Street, 3 blocks away, 1 door down from the old slave mart with the arched brick facade that you can still visit today. The paper says, in the broker's clean copperplate hand, that one Ambrose Edmund Ravenel of East Bay Street, Charleston, does hereby offer for private sale 1 female slave, mulatto, aged approximately 22 years, house-trained, healthy, of the name of Selah, at the price of $1,400. $1,400. In 1847, that was not the price of a field hand. That was not the price of a cook. That was the price of a beautiful, young, light-skinned housewoman. The price, in the ugly, private vocabulary of the Charleston market, of what was sometimes called a fancy. And the buyer, whose name is also written on the paper in that same clean hand, is a man from New Orleans, a hotelier, a man who was known up and down the coast for the particular kind of establishments he ran and the particular kind of women he kept in them. Julian Ravenel understood exactly what the paper was saying. He understood it the moment Ambrose slid it across the table to him. He understood it before he had finished reading the buyer's name. And I want you to understand something too, because it matters for everything that comes next. Ambrose Ravenel did not have to sell Selah to that particular buyer. He did not have to sell her at all. He could have kept her in the house. He could have sold her to any of a dozen respectable Charleston families who would have paid nearly as much for a housewoman of her quality. He could have, as many Charleston men did in that era with women they had grown too fond of, quietly manumitted her and settled her in a small house on the edge of the city and gone on with his life. He chose, instead, to sell her to a New Orleans hotelier. And that choice was not a business decision. It was a message. It was a message to the woman upstairs, folding linens by candlelight. And it was a message to the brother sitting across the table from him. It was Ambrose saying, in the only language he knew how to speak, "I see what has been happening in this house. I am the master here, and I will not merely remove her. I will destroy her, so completely and so publicly that the memory of her will be a thing you carry as a wound for the rest of your life." Julian looked at the paper. Then he looked up at his brother. "You will not," he said. Ambrose set his wine glass down. He did it slowly. There was no clatter, there was no drama. There was only the small, careful sound of crystal touching wood in a room in which the clock on the mantel had, just for a moment, seemed to stop ticking. "I beg your pardon?" Ambrose said. Julian did not repeat himself. He did not need to. His face, the pale, poetic, useless-looking face that had never in 26 years produced a decision worth writing down, had gone the color of paper. "She stays in this house," Julian said. Ambrose looked at him for a very long moment. And then Ambrose did something that, in the years afterward, the butler who was standing in the doorway would remember more clearly than anything else in his long life. Ambrose smiled. It was a small, tight, closed-mouth smile. The kind of smile a man smiles when he has just been given, in a poker game, exactly the card he was waiting for. "Julian," he said, in the same soft voice their father had used all their lives to end conversations. "Sit down. Have some wine. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the staff." "I am not," Julian said, "embarrassing myself." "You are," Ambrose said, "and you will regret this in the morning. So I am going to allow you to leave this table, and I am going to allow you to go to bed, and I am going to allow you to wake up tomorrow and pretend that this small, unfortunate scene did not happen. And on the day after tomorrow, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Silas Ryan will come to this house, and he will collect the girl, and he will take her to Chalmers Street, and by the end of the week, she will be on a boat to New Orleans. And you will not speak of this again. Do you understand me, brother?" Julian did not answer. He stood up from the table. He walked out of the dining room. He walked past the butler in the doorway. He walked up the stairs. He walked past his own bedroom door. He walked all the way to the end of the second-floor hall, to the small room where the personal attendant of the late Cornelia Ravenel still slept, alone, in a narrow iron bed that had once been placed there so that she would be within call if her mistress needed her in the night. He knocked, very quietly. Selah opened the door. She had already been holding a candle. She had already been listening. In a house like the Ravenel house, no argument in the dining room ever went unheard on the second floor. The walls carried voices the way a well carries water. She had heard the word "sale." She had heard the word "New Orleans." She had heard her own name spoken by both brothers in two different voices, meaning two entirely different things. She looked at Julian Ravenel in the doorway of her small room, holding his own candle in a hand that was shaking, and she said, before he could speak, the only sentence anyone in that house said that entire long, terrible night that had any real dignity to it. She said, "Don't come in here, Mr. Julian. If you come in here now, you will make it worse for me. Go back downstairs. Please." And Julian Ravenel, because whatever else was true of him, he was not in that moment a man who wanted to make it worse for her, nodded once and turned around and walked back down the hall. But he did not go back to the dining room. He went to his own room. He closed the door, he sat down at his desk, and he began to write. I want you to sit with what he was doing at that desk, because it is one of the strangest and most reckless acts in the whole of this story, and it will matter more than anything else in the days that follow. Julian Ravenel, at 26 years old, in the middle of the night, in the house of his older brother, in the city of Charleston, in the year of our Lord 1847, was writing a manumission paper. He was writing, in his own careful hand, on his own family's stationery, with his own family's seal at the top of the page, a document declaring that one Selah, aged approximately 22 years, of the household of the late Cornelia Ravenel, was, by the free and unforced act of the undersigned, hereby and forever released from bondage, and was henceforth and forevermore a free woman under the laws of God, and, in a phrase Julian added at the bottom in a hand that was not quite steady, under whatever laws of man will honor this. He signed it, he folded it, he sealed it with wax. And then he did something even more dangerous. He walked back down the hall. He knocked on Selah's door a second time, and when she opened it, he did not step into the room. He did not touch her. He simply held out the paper, folded, sealed, warm still from the wax. "Hide this," he said in a whisper. "Do not tell anyone. Do not show anyone, not Judith, not the coachman, not Silas Ryan when he comes tomorrow morning. Hide it in your dress. Keep it on your body. If they take you anywhere, if they put you on any wagon or any boat or any train, you keep this paper on your body. Do you understand me?" She understood him. She took the paper. She did not open it. She did not have to open it. She was 22 years old, and she had lived her whole life in the house of a slaveholding family. And she knew, the way any enslaved person in Charleston knew, exactly what a sealed paper in a young master's hand at midnight was likely to be. She closed her hand around it. "Mr. Julian," she said. And that was all she said. She stepped back into the small room, and she closed the door. And Julian Ravenel walked back to his own room, and he sat down on the edge of his bed, and he did not sleep at all, not for a single hour, because he had done, on the family stationery, with the family seal, without the consent of the master of the house, a thing that in South Carolina in 1847 was not a legal act. Under the state laws that had been tightened repeatedly since the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822, the great, terrible, whispered-about plot that had nearly set Charleston on fire 25 years before, no enslaved person in South Carolina could be manumitted except by a special act of the state legislature. A private manumission paper written by the younger son of a household on the family stationery in the middle of the night without the consent of the master was not worth the wax it was sealed with. But Julian Ravenel was not thinking at that desk about South Carolina law. He was thinking about a small girl in a dirt yard on a summer afternoon in 1830, pressing her hand against his split lip and saying, "Hush now, it ain't so bad." He was thinking about a 19-year-old woman reading Psalm 23 in a voice so steady that the doctor stood in the hallway to listen. He was thinking about a face he had painted in watercolor, standing at a window in the last afternoon light. A painting he had never shown to anyone that was still, at that moment, hidden in the back of the wardrobe in his room. He was thinking that if the paper he had just written was worth nothing in a South Carolina court, it might still be worth something in a Massachusetts court, or an Ohio court, or a court in England, or in France, or in any place on the earth where the woman holding it might one day somehow arrive. And he was thinking about the buyer from New Orleans. The clock on the mantel downstairs struck 2, then 3, then 4. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the servants began to move in the kitchen and the light began to come up gray over the harbor, Julian Ravenel opened his door and walked back down the hall to Sela's room. She was already dressed. She was already sitting on the edge of her narrow iron bed with her hands folded on her lap, in the exact posture of a person who has been waiting. "Go," he said. She looked up at him. "Go where, Mr. Julian?" she said. Not defiant, not afraid, just asking. And Julian Ravenel, a man who had never in his life planned anything more complicated than a picnic, a man who had never made a single practical decision about the world outside his own bedroom door, began, in the gray light of that Charleston morning, to explain to a 22-year-old enslaved woman exactly what he had spent the entire night thinking through. There was a schooner in the harbor. It was called the Rebecca Clyde. It was sailing on the morning tide for Philadelphia with a cargo of rice and indigo. The captain was a man named Isaac Home, who was a Quaker, and whose father had been a Quaker before him, and whose family, Julian knew this because Julian's own mother had known this, and had once, in her sick room, in the last month of her life, mentioned it to her son, almost by accident, had, for 2 generations, been known in certain very quiet circles as men who would carry, in the bottom of a rice hold, human cargo that was not listed on the manifest. Sela listened. "I will take you to the wharf," Julian said. "I will speak to Captain Home. He will not sail you all the way to Philadelphia. That is too far and too expensive and would be noticed. But he will sail you as far as Wilmington. From Wilmington, there are people who can take you further. My mother knew their names. I have written them for you on a second paper, which you will keep with the first." He handed her the second paper. She took it. "Mr. Julian," she said, "they will know it was you." "Yes," he said, "they will." "They will hurt you for it." "Yes," he said again, "they will." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then why?" she said. And Julian Ravenel, the poet, the painter, the useless second son, said the one thing he had come at his desk in the middle of the night to understand about himself. He said, "Because I have known you my whole life. And because if my brother sells you to that man in New Orleans, I will not be able to live in this house. I will not be able to live in this city. I will not be able to live inside my own body. So it is not a kindness, Sela, do you understand? It is the only thing I can do to survive it." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she stood up. "All right," she said. They went down the back stairs together in the gray Charleston dawn. They went through the kitchen, where Judith was already at the stove, and where Judith saw her daughter, and saw the young master, and saw the small bundle in her daughter's hand, and understood everything in a single instant, without a single word being spoken. Judith did not cry. Judith did not call out. Judith did the one thing a Charleston mother in 1847 could do for a daughter she was about to lose forever. She opened the back door, and she stood aside, and she watched them walk through it, and she did not close it behind them until they had turned the corner of the alley and were gone. By 7 o'clock, Selah and Julian Ravenel were on the wharf. By 7:30, Julian was in the captain's cabin of the Rebecca Clyde, speaking in a low voice to Isaac Hume, and pressing into Hume's hand a small, heavy leather purse containing every gold coin Julian Ravenel had been able to pull out of the household safe in the 4 terrible hours before dawn. By 8 o'clock, Selah was in the bottom of the ship, hidden in a small false compartment behind the rice bags, with 2 folded papers pressed against her skin and a piece of bread and a jar of water on the floor beside her. By 9 o'clock, the Rebecca Clyde had cast off from the wharf, and the tide was carrying her out toward the open Atlantic. By 10 o'clock, when Silas Ryan, the broker, knocked on the front door of the house on East Bay Street to collect the property he had come to collect, Selah was already 15 miles out to sea. And Julian Ravenel was sitting in the dining room, at the same long mahogany table where the paper had been laid the night before, with his hands folded on the wood in front of him, waiting for his brother to come down the stairs. He did not have to wait long. The confrontation between the 2 brothers on the morning of April the 14th, 1847 was, by every account that the household staff later gave, not a loud one. It was, in fact, one of the quietest arguments anyone in that house had ever heard between 2 grown men. Ambrose came down the stairs at 10 o'clock, freshly shaved, in a dark coat, with the same closed-mouth smile he had worn the night before at the dinner table. He walked to the front door. He opened it. He greeted Silas Ryan on the piazza. He turned back into the house and he called, in a voice that carried, "Send the girl down!" There was a silence. The butler, the same one who had been standing in the doorway the night before, cleared his throat and said in the small, careful voice of a man who understood that whatever he said next was going to make his own life worse, "Mr. Ravenel? She is not in the house." Ambrose stood very still in the front hall. He did not turn around. He said, without moving, "What did you say?" "She is not in the house, sir," the butler said again. "Mr. Julian took her out at first light." And it was at that moment that Julian Ravenel, who had been sitting in the dining room listening, stood up, walked into the front hall, met his brother's eyes, and said in a voice that was so calm and so tired that the servants who heard it did not at first understand what he was telling them, "She is gone, Ambrose. I put her on a ship. I do not know where the ship is going, and I will not tell you the name of the ship, and I will not tell you the name of the captain. So you may as well send Mr. Ryan away, because there is nothing on this property left for him to buy." Silas Ryan, standing on the piazza, heard every word. By nightfall, half of Charleston south of Broad Street had heard some version of it too. Now, I want you to understand something about Charleston, because it matters for every single thing that happens from this point forward. Charleston, in the spring of 1847, was a city in which a great deal happened in the streets and even more happened in the drawing rooms. But the true business of the city was conducted in a third, invisible place, which was the collective judgment of about 200 families. Those 200 families, the Rutledges, the Pinckneys, the Middletons, The Hugers, the Manigaults, the Ravenels knew each other's every marriage, every debt, every scandal, every affair, every death of a child, every second cousin who had gone bad in Savannah or Baltimore. And what those 200 families collectively decided about you in the drawing rooms and on the piazzas and in the church pews of the city was, in the practical sense, the whole of your fate in Charleston. By the end of April of 1847, those 200 families had decided about Julian Ravenel. He had, in the private language of the city, acted disgracefully with a servant girl. He had, in the same private language, defied his brother in the matter of the family property. He had, more dangerously, undermined the security of every household in the city by removing a slave from the state without the consent of her owner, which was, as one indignant matron said to another over tea on a piazza that May, exactly the sort of thing that leads to another Vesey business, and none of us have forgotten what that was like. The doors began to close. Not with slams. Charleston never slammed. Charleston closed doors softly. Julian Ravenel, who had once been on the guest list of every drawing room south of Broad, found himself, by June, no longer receiving invitations. The two St. Cecilia Society ladies who had, 6 months earlier, been trying quietly to arrange a marriage between him and a Rutledge cousin informed the Rutledge cousin, quietly, that the arrangement was no longer prudent. The rector at St. Philip's, who had known Julian since Julian was 7 years old, no longer greeted him on the steps. The men Julian had gone to school with, when they passed him on Meeting Street, tipped their hats a fraction of an inch less than they used to, which, in the language of Charleston, was a communication so precise and so cruel that only another Charlestonian could have understood it. Ambrose Ravenel, meanwhile, did the one thing his brother had not expected him to do. He did nothing. He did not disinherit Julian. He did not throw him out of the house. He did not pursue the ship. He did not hire investigators to find where the girl had gone. He did not, as far as anyone in the household could see, ever raise the subject again. He simply, from the morning of April the 14th onward, stopped speaking to his brother. Not in a dramatic way, not with an announcement, just silence. Julian would come into the dining room at breakfast. Ambrose would be there. Ambrose would read his newspaper. When Julian said, "Good morning, brother," Ambrose would turn a page. When Julian tried later that same week to speak about the weather, Ambrose stood up from the table, folded his napkin, and walked out of the room. Within a month, they had a system. Julian took his meals at 8, Ambrose at 9, and they did not, in any room of the house, occupy the same air at the same time. This went on for 5 years. I want you to feel the shape of those 5 years, because it is one of the strangest things in this whole strange story. 2 brothers in the same house, a large house, but not so large that they could not have heard each other on the stairs, passing each other in the halls, sleeping under the same roof, being served by the same servants, and not speaking a single word to each other for 5 whole years. In Charleston, in the 1840s and 1850s, this became one of the small private legends of the city. The Ravenel brothers, the silent house. The 2 men who had, over a servant girl, made themselves strangers to each other under their own roof. And the servants, who had, of course, their own network of communication, running from the kitchen out to the alley and from the alley into the kitchens of half the other great houses in the city, kept the story alive. They watched Julian grow thinner. They watched him stop painting. They watched him sit for whole afternoons on the back piazza, looking out at the harbor, in the exact chair his mother had once sat in a silence that no one could break. They watched him refuse to leave the house except to walk once a week down to the wharves, where he would stand for an hour looking at the ships and then walk home again. They watched Ambrose, too. They watched him become, in the small, precise ways that only servants would notice, a harder man than he had been before. They watched him drink more in the evenings. They watched him, one night in the winter of 1848, break a glass against the wall of the dining room for no reason anyone could see. They watched him marry, in 1849, a woman named Charlotte Huger, who was the daughter of an old Charleston family and who was, by every account, a decent and intelligent woman who had no idea when she said yes what kind of silence she was marrying into. Charlotte moved into the house on East Bay Street in the summer of 1849. Within 6 months, she had understood that something was terribly wrong in it. Within a year, she had figured out what it was. She never spoke of it to Ambrose. She never asked him about the second son who lived at the end of the hall and did not come down to dinner when there were guests. But she noticed. Everyone who came into that house noticed. It was, one of Ambrose's business partners said to his own wife, in the privacy of their own carriage, driving home from the dinner at the Ravenel House in the fall of 1850, "the coldest room I have ever eaten a meal in." And in Selah's absence, the third thing that no one had expected began, slowly, to happen. She began to be, in the house on East Bay Street, more present than she had ever been when she was alive in it. Judith, in the kitchen, kept a small piece of blue ribbon that Selah had worn in her hair on the day she left. She kept it in the pocket of her apron. Every morning she took it out and put it on the shelf above the stove. Every night she took it down and put it back in her pocket. She did this for 18 years, until Judith herself died in the winter of 1865, 3 months after the end of the war. She never spoke of it to anyone, but every servant in the house knew what it was and what it meant, and no one ever moved it. Julian, in his room at the end of the hall, took the small watercolor of a woman at a window out of the back of the wardrobe. He hung it above his desk. He would sit at that desk in the evenings and look at it, sometimes for an hour at a time. He wrote letters, in that room, to addresses in Philadelphia and Boston and New York. Letters he sent through intermediaries, letters he never signed with his own name, letters that were carried out of Charleston in the pockets of Quaker merchants and free black sailors and abolitionist school teachers passing through the city. He was looking for her. For 5 years he was looking for her. He never, as far as any record survives, got a single letter back. And Ambrose, at the head of the long mahogany table in the dining room, sitting across from a wife who had begun quietly to fear him, Ambrose too was thinking about the woman who was not there. He would not have said so. He would not have admitted so, even to himself. But the man who had drawn up a bill of sale for $1,400 in April of 1847 was not the man who sat in the dining room in the winter of 1851, and everyone in the household could feel the difference, even if none of them could name it. Then, on a hot Wednesday afternoon in the middle of August 1852, a letter arrived at the front door of the house on East Bay Street. It was addressed in a woman's careful hand to Mr. Julian Ravenel, Charleston, South Carolina. It had been posted from Toronto, in the province of Canada West, on the 28th of July. And when Julian took it upstairs to his room and closed the door and broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside, he read 4 sentences that had been written by a woman who had, by then, been teaching herself to write for 5 years. The 4 sentences were these: Mr. Julian, I am alive. I am well. I have a daughter, and her name is Cornelia. Selah. Julian Ravenel sat down on the edge of his bed, and for the first time in 5 years, he wept. He wept for a long time. And what he did not know, what he could not have known, was that in the room directly beneath his, Ambrose Ravenel had been standing at the bottom of the stairs when the letter arrived. Ambrose had seen the postmark. Ambrose had seen the handwriting. Ambrose had watched his brother carry it upstairs. And Ambrose Ravenel, at 36 years old, in the front hall of the house on East Bay Street, on a hot August afternoon in 1852, understood, for the first time, that the woman he had tried to destroy 5 years ago was not only still alive. She was writing letters. She was north of the border. She was, in the eyes of the law of the state of South Carolina, still his property. And she had named her daughter after his mother. I want you to understand something about the year 1852 because it changes what Ambrose Ravenel did next. 2 years earlier, in September of 1850, the United States Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act, the same law that had reached out and swallowed Henrietta Wood in Cincinnati in 1853, and that had reached back and terrified every fugitive on free soil from Boston to Chicago. Under that law, a slaveholder anywhere in the United States could file a claim on any black person he alleged to be his property, and federal commissioners would enforce the claim without a jury trial, without allowing the accused person to testify, and, critically, with a financial incentive built into the system that rewarded rulings in favor of the claimant. But Canada was not the United States. Canada in 1852 was Britain, and Britain had abolished slavery in its empire in 1833. A formerly enslaved person who reached Canadian soil, who crossed the Detroit River or the Niagara or the ferry at Lake Erie, was, from the moment they stepped off the boat, beyond the reach of any American law. That was the reason that after 1850, tens of thousands of fugitives had gone all the way to Canada instead of stopping in the northern states. Ambrose Ravenel understood this the moment he saw the Toronto postmark. He understood, standing at the bottom of his own staircase, that there was no legal action left for him to take. He could not send a slave catcher. He could not file a claim under the Fugitive Slave Act. He could not, without traveling personally to Canada and violating British law, do a single thing to reach the woman who had once been listed in his household ledger at $1,400. She was gone. Really gone. Forever gone. And this, in a man like Ambrose Ravenel, produced not fury but something much more dangerous. It produced a slow, patient, corrosive kind of rage. The rage of a man who has been permanently deprived of an outcome he had assumed 5 years ago was still in his power to arrange. He did not speak to Julian about the letter. He did not, then or ever, say the name Selah out loud in his own house. He did not even, as far as any evidence shows, admit to himself that he had seen the postmark on the stairs. But from the summer of 1852 forward, the small, hard changes that had begun in him after 1847 accelerated. He drank more heavily. He handled the plantation on the Cooper River more harshly. 2 of his overseers, who had worked for his father for years, quit in the same 12-month period, both citing the same reason. Mr. Ambrose has become impossible to work for. The number of enslaved people sold off the Cooper River plantation between 1852 and 1855 was, by the records that survive, 3 times the number sold in any comparable period under Edmund Ravenel. South Carolina Department of Archives and History. The Ravenels were, in the strange arithmetic of it, becoming a harder family, because one woman had refused to be their property. Julian, at the end of the hall, wrote back to Toronto, slowly, carefully, through the same quiet network that had carried his earlier letters. He learned over the next several years in fragments what her life had become. She had reached Wilmington on the Rebecca Clyde in the spring of 1847. She had been passed in Wilmington into the hands of a Quaker woman who ran a boarding house that was known, in certain circles, as a station on the underground network. She had traveled in the back of a series of wagons up through Virginia, into Pennsylvania, into New York State. She had reached Toronto in the winter of 1848. She had found work as a seamstress. She had married a man named Amos Bell, a free-born black carpenter who had come out of Ohio in the same wave of fugitives and who had, in the small black community of Toronto in the 1850s, become one of the founding members of a chapel and a burial society. They had a daughter in 1851, whom they named Cornelia, and Selah had, from the very first year of her freedom, been quietly teaching herself to write, using an old Bible and a slate she had bought with money she had saved from her seamstress work. She wrote in her 5th letter to Julian Ravenel in the winter of 1854, "I do not hate your brother. I do not hate anyone in that house. I hate only what the house was built to do. I have a small house here that is my own. Amos built the chairs in it. Cornelia is learning her letters. Do not send me money. Do not come here. Live your own life, Mr. Julian. That is what I ask of you. Selah." Julian read the letter. He kept it, folded, in the drawer of his desk. He did not, in the years that followed, ever send her money. He did not go to Canada. But he could not either live his own life, because he was living in the house on East Bay Street. He was living in a silence with his brother that had, by 1854, gone on for 7 years. He was watching his brother's marriage curdle. He was watching the plantation on the Cooper River become, in the servants' whispered assessments, a bad place, not like it was under the old master. He was watching Charlotte Huger, his brother's wife, a woman he had come quietly to think of as his only friend in the house, begin herself to withdraw into an upstairs bedroom in exactly the same way his own mother had withdrawn, 25 years earlier, into her lace handkerchief and her Bible. Julian Ravenel, in the years between 1852 and 1860, became, in the eyes of his brother and of Charleston, exactly the kind of man the city had always suspected he was. Useless. He stopped painting entirely. He stopped writing poetry. He stopped, for the most part, leaving the house. He read his mother's Bible in the afternoons. He wrote his letters to Toronto in the evenings. He grew, prematurely, gray at the temples. When he was 38 years old in the summer of 1859, a physician who saw him at St. Philip's Church on a Sunday morning remarked quietly to a friend on the walk home that Julian Ravenel had the face of a man of 60. And then, in the spring of 1861, the country broke. I do not need to tell you what happened in April of 1861 in Charleston, because it is the one part of this story that everyone already knows. On the 12th of April, at 4:30 in the morning, the Confederate batteries on the harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the American Civil War began. Every drawing room south of Broad Street emptied out onto the piazzas and the seawall to watch the shells arc across the harbor in the dark. It was, in the private memoirs of a dozen Charleston women, the most beautiful thing we had ever seen, and the beginning of everything terrible. Ambrose Ravenel, at 45 years old, was too old to serve in the field. But he did what men of his class and his age did. He raised money for the Confederate cause. He outfitted a company of Charleston volunteers. He served on committees. He made speeches at gatherings that a decade earlier he would not have troubled to attend. Julian Ravenel, at 40, did none of these things. He stayed in the house. He read his mother's Bible. He wrote his letters. And when, in the 4th year of the war, in the terrible winter of 1864, with Sherman's army moving north out of Georgia and Charleston expecting any day its own destruction, the household began to pack up its silver and send its most valuable belongings inland to Columbia for safekeeping, Julian Ravenel refused to help. He said to his brother in the front hall of the house, in the first sentence he had spoken directly to Ambrose in 17 years, "Let it burn. Let all of it burn. It should have burned in 1847. Ambrose stared at him for a long moment. He did not answer. He walked past his brother out onto the piazza and gave the order to load the wagons. 3 weeks later, when Sherman's army had moved past Charleston toward Columbia, and the city had, narrowly and by accident of geography, been spared the burning that Julian had wished on it, Julian Ravenel walked out of the house on East Bay Street for the last time. He did not take anything with him. He did not tell the servants where he was going. He walked out the front door, down Meeting Street, past the church where he had been baptized and confirmed, to the wharves. He bought a passage on a small blockade-running schooner that was making its way that night out through the Union blockade in the direction of Halifax. From Halifax, in the spring of 1865, he made his way, by rail, by ferry, by stagecoach, to Toronto. And on a Wednesday morning in April of 1865, in a small chapel on Elizabeth Street in Toronto, the same week that Robert E. Lee, in a parlor in a Virginia village, was putting down his sword, Julian Ravenel knocked on the door of a modest brick house belonging to Amos Bell, carpenter, and his wife Selah, seamstress. Selah opened the door. She was 40 years old. Her hair had a little gray in it at the temples. She was wearing a plain, dark dress, and behind her, at the kitchen table, a 14-year-old girl named Cornelia was working on a slate. Selah looked at Julian Ravenel on her doorstep for a long moment. She did not cry. She did not embrace him. She did not, in fact, invite him in. She said in the same steady voice she had used in the front hall of the Ravenel house 18 years earlier, "Mr. Julian, I told you not to come." "I know," Julian said. "I did not come to stay. I came to see that you were real." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stepped back from the door and she said, "Come in. My husband is at his workshop. You may meet my daughter." He came in. He met Cornelia. He drank 1 cup of tea at the kitchen table. He stayed for less than an hour. He did not tell Selah about the letter he had written to his brother that morning from his hotel. The letter he had left, sealed, on the dresser in the hotel room, addressed to Ambrose Ravenel of Charleston, South Carolina, with instructions to the hotel clerk to post it the following day. He left the Bell House at 11 o'clock in the morning. He walked back to his hotel. He wrote a second letter, this one to Charlotte Huguet Ravenel, his brother's wife, thanking her in careful sentences for 18 years of quiet kindness under a difficult roof. And then Julian Ravenel, because he had done at last the only thing he had left to do, walked down to the harbor at Toronto in the afternoon and hired a small boat and rowed himself out onto Lake Ontario and did not come back. His body was recovered 3 days later. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning. No one who had known Julian Ravenel, not Selah, not Charlotte, not the hotel clerk, not Ambrose when the letter reached him in Charleston in May, believed for a single moment that it had been accidental. Ambrose Ravenel read his brother's letter in the front hall of the house on East Bay Street on the 6th of May, 1865. The war was over. Charleston was occupied by Union troops. The Cooper River Plantation had been abandoned by its overseers and by nearly all of the enslaved people who had worked it. Most of them had walked off toward the Union lines in the winter of 1864, and the ones who had stayed had done so only long enough to bury the older among them who could not walk. The Ravenel fortune, which in 1847 had been one of the largest in the state, had been converted, over the course of 4 years of Confederate patriotism, into Confederate bonds, Confederate currency, and unpaid subscriptions to Confederate causes, all of which, on the morning of May the 6th, 1865, were worth nothing. Ambrose Ravenel, at 49 years old, was ruined. And in his hand he held a letter from his brother in Toronto, which, by the time it reached him, was already a letter from a dead man. The letter was very short. It was, in fact, a single paragraph. I will read it to you as it survives in the family papers because it is one of the few things Ambrose Ravenel kept until the end of his own life. Brother, I am writing to you from the city of Toronto in Canada West. I have found her. She is alive, and she is well, and she has built a life. I want you to know that I do not blame you in the end for what you tried to do in 1847. I understand now that we were both taught to be exactly the men we became. But I want you to know also that I have spent 18 years in your house not being able to look at you, and I do not think either of us can bear another 18. So I am going to end my own silence in the only way I know how. Do not follow me. Do not try to find her. Do not, above all, come here. Let her live. Let her live. Julian. Ambrose read the letter. He walked into the dining room. He sat down at the head of the long mahogany table where, 18 years earlier, he had slid a bill of sale across the wood to his brother. He put the letter down in front of him. And Ambrose Ravenel, a man who, in the memory of every human being who had ever met him, had never in his life shown a single unguarded emotion, put his face in his hands and did not move for a very long time. Charlotte, standing in the doorway with a tray of tea, did not go in. What happened after that is easily told because it did not take long. Ambrose sold the house on East Bay Street in the fall of 1867. He sold it to a northern buyer, a shipping merchant from New York who had come to Charleston to buy up ruined property at 10 cents on the dollar for a fraction of what it had been worth in 1847. He sold the Cooper River Plantation in 3 parcels to 3 different buyers, one of whom was a company of formerly enslaved people who had pooled their wages from 2 years of Reconstruction labor to buy back the land they had worked as slaves. He and Charlotte moved to a small house on Chalmers Street, 3 blocks from where the old slave mart still stood, in the same building it still stands in today. They had no children. They lived quietly. Ambrose Ravenel, for the rest of his life, went to church twice on Sunday, walked the same route through the city every afternoon, and did not, so far as anyone knew, ever speak the name of his brother out loud to any human being except his wife. He died in the winter of 1889. He was 73 years old. Charlotte died 4 years later, at the age of 68. They were buried in the graveyard of St. Philip's Church on Church Street, in the plot the Ravenel family had held for 4 generations. And here is the small detail, the one detail that has kept this story alive in Charleston for a century and a half, that you can go and see with your own eyes on any Sunday afternoon. The Ravenel plot in the St. Philip's graveyard contains, among the older headstones of the earlier generations, 2 stones that were placed side by side by Charlotte Ravenel in the year 1893, in the last months of her own life. One of the stones is for Ambrose Ravenel. The other is for Julian Ravenel, whose body had been sent back from Toronto in a plain pine coffin in the summer of 1865 and had been buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave at the edge of the family plot. Charlotte, before she died, had a stone cut for him and set beside her husband's. The 2 stones do not face each other. They face east. They face, if you follow the compass of them, the harbor. They face past the harbor, the open Atlantic. They face, in the exact bearing of the 2 carvings, the direction in which the schooner Rebecca Clyde had sailed on the morning of April the 14th, 1847. They face her. Charlotte Ravenel never explained the arrangement to anyone, but the sexton of St. Philip's Church, who set the stones, remembered, many years later, that Mrs. Ravenel had come to him with a compass in her hand, and had herself cited the exact angle of the 2 headstones, and had said only one sentence about it. She had said, "They both loved her, Reverend, in their own ways. Let them look toward her." That is what the 2 graves face. Now, because this is a story about slavery, and because slavery in Charleston did not end in the graveyard of an old white family, but in the small, ordinary lives that were rebuilt in freedom in the North, I want to tell you what happened to the woman herself. Selah Bell lived out the rest of her life in Toronto. She did not, as far as any record shows, ever return to Charleston. She did not attend Julian Ravenel's funeral in 1865 because she did not want to sit beside his brother's silence for the rest of her life. She continued her seamstress work. She and Amos Bell had 2 more children, a boy named Isaac, born in 1855, and a girl named Judith, born in 1859, named for the mother Selah had left behind in the kitchen on East Bay Street. Judith Bell would grow up to be one of the first black school teachers in Toronto. Isaac Bell would go to work with his father in the carpentry trade and would, in the 1880s, build the pews of a small Baptist church on Chestnut Street that is still standing today. Selah taught all 3 of her children to read. She taught them also to write. She kept, in a small tin box on the shelf above her bed, the 2 folded papers Julian Ravenel had given her on the morning of April the 14th, 1847, the sealed manumission paper that had never been worth the wax it had been sealed with, and the second paper with the names of the Quaker stations up the coast. She kept them, she told her daughter Cornelia many years later, not because they gave me my freedom. I gave myself my freedom. But because a man died to hand them to me, and I do not throw such things away. She died in Toronto in the winter of 1901. She was 76 years old. She is buried in the Necropolis Cemetery in Toronto, next to Amos Bell, in a plot her son Isaac laid out with his own carpenter's tools. Her stone is small. It does not mention Charleston. It says only, Selah Bell, wife, mother, seamstress, 1825 to 1901. I gave myself my freedom. Her children lived out the 20th century in Canada. Her grandchildren, one of whom served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War, and one of whom, a granddaughter named Cornelia Bell Wilson, would become in the 1940s one of the first black women admitted to nursing school at the University of Toronto, carried her name forward into a country that had never held her as property. The house on East Bay Street still stands. If you walk down that street in Charleston today, you can find it. 3 stories of old ivory stucco with black shutters and a wrought iron gate stamped on both sides with the Ravenel family monogram. It is a private residence now. The people who live there are pleasant. If you ask them about the Ravenels, they will tell you that they know the family used to own the house and that there is a family plot at St. Philip's. If you ask them about the 2 graves that face the harbor, they will look at you strangely and say that they have never noticed. But the sexton of St. Philip's will show them to you, if you ask. He has been showing them to visitors quietly for many years. He tells the story the way it was told to him by the sexton before him, who was told it by the sexton before him. It is one of the small, whispered, unofficial stories of the city, the kind of story Charleston has always specialized in, the kind of story that never quite makes it into the official histories, because the official histories were written by the families whose fortunes were built on the very sin the story is about. But it is not forgotten. It has never quite been forgotten. Because in the end, this is what old Charleston stories are for. They're not for the guidebooks. They are not for the walking tours. They are for the quiet Sunday afternoons in a graveyard, when the light is coming in low and gold through the live oaks, and a stranger stops and asks the sexton why 2 brothers' headstones do not face each other. And the sexton says, in the low voice that these things have always been said in, "They face the woman they both loved, sir. She was a slave in that house. Her name was Selah, and she outlived both of them in a country that would never let them own her." That is the story. That is the whole story. 2 brothers, in a house on East Bay Street in the spring of 1847. A bill of sale on a table. A single word spoken across the mahogany. A ship on the morning tide. A silence that lasted 18 years. A letter from Toronto. A boat on Lake Ontario. 2 headstones facing east. And a woman named Selah, who had been born property in a Charleston kitchen in 1825, and who died a free woman in a Toronto winter in 1901, with 3 children reading their letters at her bedside, and 2 folded papers in a tin box on the shelf above her bed. She was not the largest figure in the history of American slavery. She did not lead an uprising. She did not write a book. She did not, in her own lifetime, ever become famous. She was, in the ordinary measure of it, an ordinary enslaved woman who got out, one of the tens of thousands who reached the northern lakes, one of the ordinary miracles that the Underground Railroad carried across the border in the years before the war. But she broke 2 men. Not because she wanted to. She never wanted to. She would have preferred all the way to the end of her life that the 2 brothers had simply been decent to each other and let her go. But the world she had been born into did not allow such simple decencies, and so the 2 brothers broke themselves against her instead. Ambrose, on the rock of a rage he could never quite bring himself to name, and Julian, on the softer rock of a love he had never been permitted to speak out loud. And the house on East Bay Street, which had been built on the backs of 200 years of the traffic in human beings, emptied out around them. That is what those 2 graves face. That is why they still face it. If this story has stayed with you tonight, if it has crawled into some quiet corner of you and made itself at home the way old Charleston stories do, I want you to do one small thing for her. Say her name once, out loud, before you close this video. Selah. Because she was born property in a kitchen on East Bay Street in 1825, and she was buried a free woman in a Toronto graveyard in 1901. And the ordinary act of speaking her name is the one small piece of justice that is still in our hands. Then share this with someone you love, because someone you love needs to hear that in a house on East Bay Street in the spring of 1847, one small enslaved woman quietly refused to be sold. And by the end of her life, the whole world that had tried to sell her was gone, and she was still standing. And if you want to keep walking with me through these forgotten corners of history, the names half buried in old plots, the letters folded in tin boxes on shelves in the north, the stories the guidebooks will never tell you, then stay a while. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. There are so many more names waiting in the dark of these old southern cities. We are not done speaking them.